your teachers. And you start to realize the little mini events that happened over the course of your life.
The whole situation is honestly ridiculous. There's this sarcastic back and forth about being Father of the Year for allowing certain language to be used, even though the actress herself didn't initially want to say it and only later decided she was ready. Ironically, while others were being considered for the role, the production ended up making Nezzy repeat that same line dozens if not hundreds of times, something that's jokingly acknowledged as a mistake they'll pay for later. We then see Blake Lively presented as Lady Poole, and the tone shifts into a broader commentary. What if everything we've watched unfold over the last 11 months regarding Blake Lively's lawsuit against Justin Baldoni has been nothing more than smoke and mirrors? There's a growing argument that Lively's case may be on the verge of falling apart, largely because Wayfarer has already placed into the public record what could be the most damaging evidence she could face in front of a judge or jury. The key issue is that Blake Lively has moved to keep her own text messages, sealed, including messages she personally sent to Justin Baldoni. That's especially strange given that Baldoni's lawsuit is fully public and includes those same text messages, which he himself released. The contrast raises obvious questions. Why would Lively want to seal communications that the other party has already made public? The explanation, according to critics, is that if someone only reads Blake Lively's complaint and ignores the broader context provided in Baldoni's case, it's easy to assume she was wronged. Her filings tell only her side of the story and leave out the surrounding conversations and circumstances that were happening behind the scenes. This has become even more significant as Lively now faces two major dispositive motions. One is a motion for judgment on the pleadings, where Wayfarer argues that her employment discrimination claims filed under New York law fall outside the territorial reach of California's Fair Employment and Housing Act. They contend that California's discrimination laws apply only within California and to conduct that actually occurred there, which they argue is not the case here. The second is a motion for summary judgment, where Wayfarer lays out why Lively's claims fail as a matter of law, arguing there is no genuine dispute of material fact and that the allegations don't meet the legal standard for sexual harassment or a hostile work environment. One of the most notable points raised is that Lively herself allegedly engaged in the very behaviors she later claimed were unacceptable for others. She also required the signing of a 17-point agreement that she described as necessary protections for returning to work. However, Wayfarer's evidence suggests that nearly all of those protections were already in place long before she demanded them. Most importantly, there was a proposed amendment to her loan-out agreement, one that was never actually signed, that spelled out strict boundaries: no personal relationship discussions, no hugging on set, no conversations about marriages or private intimate experiences, number personal commentary, no remarks about appearance, no use of the word sexy, and no spontaneous or unscripted kissing. According to Wayfarer, all of these rules and safeguards were already implemented regardless, undermining the claim that the environment was hostile or unlawful in the way Lively now alleges. Blake Lively didn't just gain editing approval. She also took on significantly more control on set and even brought Sonia regionally, just the distributor, into a far more active role in the production. One of the most critical aspects of Wayfarer's motion for summary judgment is that it shifts the focus away from what Baldoni allegedly said and instead examines the environment Blake herself fostered. The motion looks closely at her relationships with the cast and crew and whether those dynamics made certain conversations highly charged or made words like sexy feel acceptable within that context. It raises key questions. Did Blake herself engage in these types of conversations? Did she participate in unscripted kissing, comment on people's appearances, or engage in behavior she later claimed was inappropriate for others? More importantly, did she continue this conduct after the so-called protections were put in place and even before them? Were these interactions consensual? And were the conversations she later described as offensive ones she actively initiated or encouraged? All of these factors are central to determining whether workplace sexual harassment actually occurred, especially since harassment law can extend beyond the physical set and into work-related interactions outside formal filming. Blake's behavior prior to filming, in particular, presents a major challenge for her if a jury were ever to see the full text message record. For example, her complaint alleges that there were no intimacy coordinators and accuses Justin Baldoni of creating scenes that were far more explicit than what she had agreed to in the script. However, a text Baldoni sent her on April 5, 2023, directly contradicts that claim. In it, he told her that he had just hired an intimacy coordinator he loved, and that they would set up a meeting with her the following week. Blake responded by saying she felt fine and could meet the coordinator once filming started, effectively declining the introduction. Despite this, she later complained that there was no intimacy coordinator at all, a contradiction that creates a serious credibility issue, especially since deposition, testimony and discovery from the coordinator confirmed their involvement. Things become even more problematic when looking at a text exchange that followed a few days later. One of Blake's complaints was that Justin allegedly shared personal anecdotes from his life. Yet the message she sent to him ventures into very personal territory herself. She praised him enthusiastically, said she was inspired by him, and expressed excitement about what they were going to create together. She then offered to either send him her version of a scene or read it with him in person, adding that, if he knew her better, he would understand how flirty and yummy her style of playful banter was, describing it as her love language, spicy, bold, and teasing. She even suggested acting it out for him to make sure the tone came through. Notably, this message is about Blake herself, not her character Lily. Saying that knowing her personally would change how the scene plays raises obvious questions about boundaries. Some could interpret the tone as flirtatious or even as making a pass. Justin's response, however, does not mirror that energy at all. He apologized for his delayed reply, explained he had been emotional because his family had just left for several weeks, and then redirected the conversation entirely back to the film. He emphasized that Lily needed to be witty, playful, and bold, explained why Blake was right for the role, and framed those qualities strictly within the character and story. He never flirted back, never personalized the exchange, and kept the focus on the creative vision. Blake thanked him, and the conversation ended there. This is another clear example of Blake crossing lines and blurring boundaries. By mixing herself with her character, Lily, she repeatedly describes herself as Lily, which makes any later interpretation of conversations about the character feel personal to her rather than purely professional. That distinction matters, because when someone reads those messages, they aren't seeing an actor discussing a role, they're seeing Blake talking about herself. That's why, when I think back to claims that Ryan allegedly yelled at her, it makes sense that he may have seen some of these texts. He wouldn't have been reading discussions about Lily as a character. He would have been reading Blake describing herself in a flirty, personal way. Once filming actually began, many of the complaints Blake later raised were undermined by her own conduct, either before or immediately after the alleged incidents. When you line up the timeline of events alongside Wayfarer's motion for summary judgment and their statement of facts, the inconsistencies become difficult to ignore. For instance, on the same day she accuses Mr. Heath of entering her trailer uninvited and allegedly copying her look, she characterizes the experience as disturbing. Yet the very next day, literally one day later, she sends Justin a text talking about the sexy beanie she plans to wear. So, while she claims harassment one day, the next she is voluntarily engaging in playful, sexualized language with the director. One of Blake's major complaints was that Justin used the word sexy to describe dialogue or scenes, yet there is a video of her describing her own boots as sexy. And there is also a text message she sent on May 17th that directly contradicts her claims. In that message, she says, "We'll show you both ways, but the beanie is much sexier. It feels more TV, especially with the crop top in the snow. It justifies the rest of the skin." She even adds that it's the kind of look she would check out on another woman walking down the street. That is Blake herself describing another woman and, by implication, herself as sexy. This isn't language being imposed on her. It's language she is actively using. What's particularly interesting is that by carefully reviewing Wayfarer's motion for summary judgment and their factual timeline, you can actually reconstruct parts of Blake's amended complaint that were redacted. The reason is simple. Many of those missing pieces are the same text messages that already appear in Wayfarer's lawsuit or in the timeline of relevant events. That makes it especially odd that Blake is now trying to keep those very same messages sealed, even though their contents are already known. She has also moved to hide Justin's communications with the intimacy coordinator messages that were previously public, as well as her own texts from the same day. She claims Justin and Jamie engaged in sexual harassment. According to her lawsuit, that day included the viewing of a video involving Natasha Heath, a dancing scene, and disputes over the use of the word sexy. Yet later that same night, there is a text exchange that paints a very different picture. Justin texts her saying he won't gush because she teased him for being sentimental, but that she was amazing that day. Blake responds by thanking him, saying she appreciates it, describing herself again as a ballbuster, and adding that she cares deeply about the work and always wants to deliver. She then tells him he was terrific and says she's proud of everything they accomplished that day. When all of this is viewed together, it creates a serious credibility problem, one where Blake's own words and behavior repeatedly contradict the narrative presented in her complaint. On a day-to-day level, it's genuinely hard to understand how someone who claims to be deeply irritated, offended, or disturbed by another person's behavior would simultaneously tell that same person how proud they are of them and how proud they are of the work they've done together. What makes this even stranger is that these very communications are now being hidden and marked as confidential. That feels less like protection and more like an effort to mislead, because if someone were new to this case and hadn't followed Wayfarer's filings closely, they'd never realize that these friendly, affirming exchanges were happening at the exact same time as the alleged misconduct. The fact that simple thank you messages where she refers to herself as a ballbuster and expresses appreciation are being labeled private is baffling, because there is nothing remotely confidential about them. What stands out even more is that nearly everything centers around two specific dates, the 16th and the 23rd, which are now being framed as the days she was made uncomfortable. Yet after those dates, she went to Sony while she had COVID to raise complaints, even though she had already addressed some of these issues earlier. Despite that, she continued engaging in the very same type of interactions she now characterizes as inappropriate, even after formally making complaints to Sony. She sent Justin a text on June 2nd inviting him into her trailer while she was pumping so they could run lines together. That directly contradicts later claims that no one was allowed in her trailer at all. The behavior simply doesn't line up. Of course, she may argue that intent matters, that something felt acceptable at one moment and unacceptable at another, and that's a fair point in theory. But her conduct after the alleged incidents doesn't reflect someone who genuinely felt sexually harassed. Instead, it shows continued warmth, cooperation, and personal engagement. Looking at other dates reinforces that contradiction. On June 9th, as she was preparing to head to set, she talked about picking up drinks for Justin and Brandon, even mentioning getting a hot matcha for Justin, all while maintaining that she was deeply offended by being called sexy. The inconsistency is hard to ignore. Then, on June 10th, Justin sent her a message, thanking her for giving 110% that week, acknowledging how difficult it must have been to shoot while her partner was away and while she was exhausted, and expressing genuine appreciation for the extra effort she put in to help the production catch up. He also complimented her work in a scene, saying it was beautiful, and wished her a good weekend. Her response was equally warm. She thanked him for the message, said she appreciated his empathy, and told him she returned that same empathy because they were in the same boat. Taken together, these exchanges paint a picture that is fundamentally at odds with the narrative of ongoing discomfort or harassment she later presented. She even goes so far as to say, "I'm always trying to give my all and then half again more. You do too, and I appreciate it." Which makes it even more baffling that these text messages are now being marked as confidential. It's honestly hard to wrap your head around how something so ordinary and already known can suddenly be treated as private, especially when those same messages have already been part of the public record. What's more unbelievable is that she's now telling Judge Lamont that she doesn't have time to review the text messages and claims she needs to go through 180 documents to decide what should remain confidential, even though much of this material has already been seen. These messages weren't confidential when they appeared in the case filed against her, but now, suddenly, they are. It feels less like a legitimate concern and more like an attempt to stonewall, delay, and control the narrative for as long as possible. If everything were laid out the way it was in Wayfarer's motion for summary judgment, it would become nearly impossible for the media to frame the story the way they have, especially moments like the video of Justin making the comment about missing the sexual harassment meeting, which sparked outrage when viewed in isolation. That reaction changes dramatically once you place it next to the full context of Blake's own text messages. The playful banter, the ball-busting, the references to being flirty without teeth, the sexy beanie, and the invitations to come into her trailer. When you see the entire picture, it tells a very different story. What's striking is that the tone seems to shift once she's home with her husband. Suddenly, there's an urgency about seeing the dailies, and during the strike there are repeated requests for footage. Based on her own communications, it appears that Justin was consistently trying to steer the focus back to Lily, the character, while Blake herself was communicating as Blake, not Lily. The lines between character and reality appear increasingly blurred, with fantasy and fiction bleeding into real-life emotions. From that perspective, it looks less like harassment and more like a breakdown in professional boundaries followed by a reinterpretation of events after the fact. The argument being made is that what ultimately happened wasn't misconduct, but rejection, something she allegedly struggled to process. From there, the narrative shifts into claims of sexual harassment, conveniently aligning with gaining greater control over the film at the same time. In that framing, the situation works on two levels, appeasing personal issues at home while also securing leverage over the production itself. In the end, it's not alleged smear campaigns or second-hand accounts that pose the biggest problem for her case. It's her own text messages. Her direct communications with Justin and others involved in the film are what undermine her claims most severely. Those messages are the real smoking gun, and they're why this case faces such an uphill battle.